Hi, this is Mike Clancy, and today I am very excited to be interviewing Joe Houston, a gentleman who played a key role in Project Azorian, the CIA's attempt to covertly recover a Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean in 1974. Joe Houston was the chief optical engineer for Project Azorian, and he is mentioned prominently in the books The Taking of K-129 by Josh Dean and Red November by W. Craig Reed. The underwater camera and lighting gear he designed was crucial to the success of the project, as it allowed the size and weight of the K-129 submarine to be accurately estimated from photographs taken during the Glomar 2 mission to the wreck site in 1970, prompting a significant redesign of both the Glomar Explorer and the capture vehicle. Joe, thanks so much for agreeing to do this interview.
My pleasure, Mike. Looking forward to it.
Great. Joe, can you describe how you came to be involved with Project Azorian?
It started about the time as the Type 18 periscope contract that was awarded by the Navy to ITEC Corporation. ITEC Corporation, for those who are not familiar with it, is written up in a book called Spy Capitalism. I highly recommend it. It gives background to the beginnings and the combinations of Air Force generals, CIA workers, and venture capitalists. Um, I was the chief optical engineer for the Type 18 Advanced Development Program. It was a prototype program in competition with the Cole-Morgan Corporation, maker of periscopes since 1916. And it involved an image motion stabilization system with a submarine at sea. Before then, if you were taking pictures through the periscope, you had to be careful and watch out for smear, owing to the motions of the submarine itself, the platform. The platform would roll, it would pitch, it would yaw, smear the images. ITEC and Cole Morgan decided to add a new technology, and we were at sea trials finally in the USS Dace in the Atlantic, running against simulated targets, aircraft, destroyers, aircraft carriers, a lot of vessels, taking pictures for a week. And we came back, and I had a call from John Wolfe, who was the vice president for special projects, otherwise known as most of the CIA projects, called me to his office and said, "We need to talk. I have a brown bag here, and we'll have lunch." I took him up on it, and he sat down and described this contract that had been awarded by Howard Hughes, he said, Summa Corporation. Howard Hughes wanted to take pictures of fields of manganese nodules because he decided to go into the business of mining, and these nodules are loaded with critical minerals like cobalt, copper, and so forth, and sounded like a reasonable project to be involved in. But first, I had to know what a manganese nodule was to understand what John was talking about. And sure enough, after looking over the material and talking about the state of the art of underwater photography, I learned that he wanted to go 3 miles under the surface and take these pictures. The state of the art at that time was 300 or 400 feet, with exception maybe of a few shipwrecks, reefs, and so forth, maybe 1,000, 2,000 feet. Uh, I gulped and I said, "John, that's a bit over my pay grade." And he said, "Well, you're supposed to be the expert as chief optical engineer for underwater systems. You can figure out something for us." So I said, "Yes, I'll take a look at it, but what are the requirements?" He said, "Well, other than 3 miles deep and the pressure, you're going to have to look at a very large field of nodules." So I said, "How large?" He said, "Oh, about 100 feet by 300 feet." And I thought a minute and I said, "Yeah, that's a pretty big field. That's about the size of the submarine I got off of last weekend." Uh, I, I saw John clutch his belly and back off and turn white and all that. And he said, I think we're going to have to sign a piece of paper before we continue. And
Uh,
I thought, oh, I think I know the target. This is a cover story. Anyway, I signed the paper. It had a big label, Central Intelligence Agency. Well, I'd done this several times before. In fact, the most recent was Project Corona, which was a spy satellite program.
yeah.
I was in charge of all the optics. And so I said, well, okay, let's find out. Let's get some detail. If you're going to take pictures of these nodules, what is the resolution you're looking for? And he said 2 or 3 millimeters. I thought, oh, and maybe in 20-meter water. He said, well, in addition to that, we have to take pictures without shadows. I said, I know how to do that, but that requires a lot of strobe lights. And he said, we need the three-dimensional rendering. And that sounded strange for a pool, a puddle on the bottom of the ocean.
It sounds like requirements creep. He kept loading more things onto you.
I, I, I decided, well, this is getting really, really interesting. So I finally said, okay, you got a deal. He said, when you can get to work? And I said, well, I just finished the sea trials and I don't have anything to do right now. And he said, well, we have a visitor from the agency coming in next Monday. He wants to see a plan. We need to get started because he's looking for delivery of the plans in a month. And so I think you've got a lot of work to do. Maybe you ought to leave. And I said, not without a couple of pieces of information. I said, number one, if we're going to get rid of shadows and take pictures with turbidity and other issues, I want to know exactly what water we're going to be in, which means the location. And he thought a minute and said, okay. And I said, and I want a strobe light from Hydro Products as quickly as possible. I've got to look at the beam and measure the beam size. And he said, why? And I said, well, on the area that side, I'm using a lot of strobe lights and I'll need to overlap them so that the number of photons that land in the center are the same as the number at the edge of the field. You said get rid of shadows. Okay. And he wrote it down. And I said, I'll start right now and I'll be making some measurements and running some calculations. And he said, well, I'll take care of it. The next morning, the strobe light showed up on my desk. It was delivered overnight from San Diego.
Wow.
And I took it home and I put it in the cranberry bog behind our house in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Cranberry bogs are common in New England. This one was about 4 feet deep. I took the strobe, put it on the shoreline, wired it up. I had a circuit set up, switches and all. I waded out into the middle and I put 5 white targets out in the middle. We were lucky we had a huge overarching limb that went over the pond almost to the other side. So I had my son get on the shoreline at about 2 o'clock in the morning, pitch dark. I climbed up the limb, leaned over my 35 millimeter camera on time exposure. I got several pictures calling out to Brant, our son, each time, fire, fire, fire. After a dozen pictures, I went down, developed them, and took them in the next morning. We were ready to give the briefing when Mr. John Parangowski signed in the lobby as John P. This was common practice for the next several weeks.
Yeah, just a quick note for our listeners. John Parangowski was a legendary CIA project manager, and he, in fact, was the project manager for Project Azorian. He really ran the show.
He really did. I learned later that he was also instrumental in getting the U2 out
Yes.
online and the air in 9 months with Kelly Johnson and later on with SR-71, Oxcart.
Yep.
John was an incredible individual.
Yeah.
I looked at him as the man who came to dinner. He was graceful, he was charming, and he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. When I showed the pictures to him, and this is in the book that you, Mike, recommended, the Taking of K-129, when I showed him the pictures, he looked carefully and he said, what are those objects in there? And I said, they're catfish. And he laughed, it's catfish. And I said, yes, my son and I raise catfish. These are pets and we feed them pellets every evening. And he said, oh, then why don't we call this the catfish solution? And it stayed that way throughout the program. His sidekick, Chief Engineer Alex Holzer, now worked on the program for several weeks. I finally came up with a design I was happy with. I turned it over to Alex, and that was the end of my involvement. So,
Fantastic. So, were you involved in um, uh, any additional testing of the system or design work or anything like that?
it's very interesting. And many projects with the agency, with the compartments and all that. I wasn't given any further task. I signed over the designs and I made sure all the equipment was lined up. The contacts had been made with the proper companies. You can imagine there were a select few companies that were able to work directly with the agency.
Mhm.
ITEC was one of just a very few companies. There were a lot of front companies where the president might be read on the program, a CEO or some board member who could provide cover for the details.
Mhm.
In this case, I left the project. I went on to do some other things. As a matter of fact, uh, ITEC won the contract against Cole Morgan, but as I understand it, but ITEC elected to get out of that business, the periscope business. They really didn't have the infrastructure. And
Mhm.
so I moved over and worked for Cole Morgan for a while, stayed with the Navy and left ITEC. But I had no role, no contact, nothing until I saw the headlines at the Burbank airport, something about a Russian sub. A
Mhm.
friend who was with me, and we were headed over to the skunk works across the street, looked at me and he said, that's incredible. Have you seen that? And I said, no, that's amazing, isn't it?
Mhm.
That's the last contact I had.
Okay, fantastic. Well, did you realize at the time the impact your system had on the project in terms of being able to figure out the weight and the size of the submarine?
Uh, I had no idea.
Mhm.
It was remarkable. I remember spending so much time with Alex and John P. and
Mhm.
emphasizing the fact that we could not allow shadows, that the 3D rendering was the only way. Of course, iTech was a house based on 3D rendering. It was overhead surveillance. We did everything in 3 dimensions, and it turned out that insisting on the 3 dimensional aspect, the rendering of the submarine in situ, that is on the ocean floor, I understand allowed the builders of the Glomar Explorer to see clearly that the sub was tilted at some extreme angle
Mhm.
so that when pictures were taken head on, 2 dimensional pictures taken head on, the foreshortening made
Yes.
the submarine look smaller. And by rendering in 3D, you were able to see the tilt, and it turned out it was about 15 feet larger. And so
Mhm.
the moon pool had to be increased, which meant the uh, Glomar Explorer itself had to be increased the size. That slowed the program down,
Mhm.
caused a huge overrun. The time was extended by months because the new Glomar Explorer could not get through the Panama Canal and had to go around
Right.
for
And to
it.
make it wider.
So it had, as I understand later, a tremendous impact.
Yes.
One might say a negative impact on the program, on the finances.
Well, it would have been bad if they hadn't taken it into account and they got there and it wouldn't fit, you know?
So I guess
Yeah.
everything worked out, but it was a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. I learned yesterday or a couple of days ago, my interview with Ray Feldman, that the submarine was on a slope and it was sloping down about 10 degrees.
Hmm,
Yeah. The bow was
correct.
heading down. It was about 10 degrees. And the submarine was rolled over about 45-degree angle on the side there.
It was huge from what I could tell based on the picture that shows up in the Spy Museum, the CIA
Yeah.
Museum. There's a scale model,
Yes.
and I just couldn't believe the angle that at which it landed after it broken up and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
But
well, the other remarkable thing about that model is the fact that, and it was your camera that enabled that model to be built, and it's extremely detailed. I mean, look at it, you can see every little thing. And talking with Ray, he was telling me that Ray Feldman that they actually lined up on certain cracks in the hull and a towing link on the bow of the submarine. That level of detail, and they would line up on that to get the capture vehicle positioned exactly right over the capture over the submarine over the target
I
object.
had no idea, but I knew from photogrammetry and the fact that iTech was built on photogrammetry. It's
Yeah.
the heart of the business that we had something to share. And based on the work that I'd done at MIT with Papa Flash, Dr. Edgerton,
Mm. He was
EG&T,
famous. Hmm.
I realized that from his early days in strobe photography, the thing you
Hmm.
want to do is render the object in 3D so you can understand how it works, when it's working. In fact, you can even look at the dynamics of objects underwater.
Yeah.
And 3D is incredibly important.
Yeah. How in your design, how did you you know uh, make the thing work at a depth of 16,500 feet when cameras had typically operated much shallower? There's tremendous pressure down there. What did you design that in?
I'll
How did
have
you
to give
design that?
I'll have to give full credit to a classmate of mine at the University of Texas. We went through Texas together. He was a mechanical engineer, a Navy ROTC. I was
Mhm.
an astronomer, the first class of astronomy at the University of Texas, and I had done civil engineering before I took up astronomy, and so I knew Joe, and Joe was working at Point Hueneme, the Navy Test Center,
Yeah.
with Dr. Jerry Staciu, uh, both remarkable mechanical engineers. They were responsible for pressure vessel
Mhm.
development, did some wonderful mathematics, worked out the details of seating lenses in metal without destroying the lens itself. Were responsible for the evolution of acrylic for our windows,
Hmm.
number of breakthroughs, and with working with Bob Hittleman of Hydro Products, the CEO of Hydro Products, they came up with some incredible equipment that would withstand the pressures of 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 pounds per
Yeah.
square inch.
Yeah.
So it was to their credit that we were able to do that.
Yeah. That's fantastic. What a challenge. Okay. Well, now I'd like to introduce a bit of cloak and dagger into the Project Azorian story by asking Joe to talk about a meeting he had with Baron Victor Rothschild in 1970 to talk about the Glomar Explorer and Howard Hughes's supposed interest in seafloor mining of manganese nodules. This meeting was set up by no less than the director of the CIA himself, Richard Helms. First, some background. There was a spy ring that operated in the British government from the 1930s through the 1950s, which passed many highly classified secrets to the Soviet Union. This spy ring came to be known as the Cambridge Five because of the fact that its members got to know each other when they were students at Cambridge University in the 1930s. The existence of the Cambridge Five spy ring was the inspiration for many famous books and films, including Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré and the James Bond book From Russia with Love by Ian Fleming. Donald MacLean and Guy Burgess were the first of the Cambridge Five to be discovered, and they fled to the Soviet Union in 1951. They were followed by Kim Philby, who fled to the Soviet Union in 1963. The fourth and fifth members of the spy ring, Anthony Blunt and John Cairncross, both confessed and gave up information in 1964 in exchange for immunity, although their involvement and confessions were not made public until 1979. A number of historians have alleged that there was at least one additional member of the spy ring and identified about a half a dozen possible candidates. Among those candidates was none other than Baron Victor Rothschild, the gentleman who visited Joe Houston in 1970 to talk about the Glomar Explorer and seafloor mining. Lord Rothschild was perhaps best described as a Renaissance man. Of course, he came from one of the most famous, wealthy, aristocratic, and powerful families in all of Europe, but he was also an accomplished athlete as a young man, a brilliant scientist, an heroic World War II British intelligence officer, a peer in the House of Lords, a confidant of Winston Churchill, a senior advisor to the governments of both Edward Heath and Margaret Thatcher, and a senior executive with both Royal Dutch Shell and the Rothschild Banking Group. Lord Rothschild was never definitively identified as a Soviet spy. However, allegations made against him, most famously in the book The Fifth Man by Roland Perry, and his close association with several members of the Cambridge Five, dating all the way back to their days at Cambridge together, resulted in a cloud of suspicion hanging over him for much of his life. Now, some 35 years after his death, the consensus picture that emerges is nuanced. Rothschild was a complex man with complicated relationships and complicated loyalties who operated in gray areas between the governments of both Britain and the Soviet Union. He often acted as an agent of influence who sought to sway the policies of both countries to his liking, particularly with regard to his strong support for the formation of the State of Israel. He probably crossed lines that he shouldn't have crossed, and he probably shared information with the Soviets that he shouldn't have shared. But his motivations, methods, and activities did not make him a Soviet spy, at least not in the way that most people would interpret that term. Lord Rothschild was a remarkable and complex man, and his legacy is remarkable and complex. So, with that background in mind, Joe, tell us about your meeting with Lord Rothschild and its connection to Project Azorian. How did it get set up? What were you told was the purpose, and what transpired at that meeting?
Well, Mike, it started with a call from the chairman of the board's office, Frank Lindsay. Um, One morning, he said that he would like to meet and discuss a potential visitor and the agenda and go over some details with me. If I'd come up to his private office, we could talk, I could make some notes, and he'd give direction. I got there, he said, our visitor next week is going to be Lord Rothschild, and I want you to tell him everything about the program, everything that you're doing. He's just been elected to the board of directors and a vice president of world research at Royal Dutch Shell.
Mhm.
And Shell has just acquired a processing plant, manganese processing plant in Malaysia. All this adds up to the fact that perhaps he would be interested in the work that you're doing, and that iTech can be involved in selling hardware to Royal Dutch Shell and others. You're free to talk about your relationship with Howard Hughes, everything but the target. And I said, well, I really don't know that much about the target, so if that'll be easy to do. I then got myself together some overhead view graphs and a piece, a nodule itself, and ready for show and tell day. I was,
Well, speaking of show and tell, I'm going to interject here. This
yes,
is a manganese nodule encased in lucite, and this actually came from the program. These were put together and by Summa Corporation and Golden Marine and handed out to the press and visitors to facilities to help foster the cover story. And I want to give a shout out to a gentleman by the name of James Hoyle, that lives down in Southern California. He saw my YouTube channel and reached out to me. It turns out his father, Jack Hoyle, worked in the program. James sent me a great picture of his father, Jack, on the floor of the moon pool on the Glomar Explorer in 1972. And this module belonged to him. And James kindly gave this to me and mailed it to me. And I really want to really say heartfelt thanks on that because goes a long way to tell people what the whole story was, the cover story was all about. So go ahead, Joe.
it looks very, very familiar.
Yes.
And with the advent of the acquisition of Billion, the foundry, more or less, for manganese nodule, um, the stories seem to add up, but the question remains, why in the middle of the end of a very highly classified project would someone from Royal Dutch Shell get his way into the iTech Corporation, into the bowels of the corporation, and go into detail on what the relationship between iTech and Summa Corporation was alleged to be and what was the purpose. Bothersome, but Frank, Mr. Lindsay said there are a number of factors at work here, Joe, not to worry. Number one, I used to jump out of airplanes. I worked for the OSS during World War II. I parachuted into Yugoslavia. I blew up railroad tracks, formed teams of people who worked behind the enemy lines, and we did a lot of damage to the German government. Well, that made sense. And he said, of course, I worked. Lord Victor at that time was a MI5 operative, and we got to know each other. Very friendly. We shared stories, and we've kept in touch all these years.
I see.
And Director Helms was one of the group that I worked with. So it's sort of like Old Home Week, and we'd like to share the information. It sounded good to me, and I got ready. I met him. There was no one else in the room. This was to be a one-on-one, no witnesses, nothing, which in of itself was sort of unusual in a situation like this.
Sure.
I was totally on my own. Then we got down to questions, and I recall some of the questions now were fairly leading. I can't make a conspiracy out of the questions, but things like, well, Joe, so you photograph these fields of nodules and you need to collect them. How are you going to scoop them up? And I said, well, fortunately, I'm an optical engineer. I'm no longer a civil engineer, but in Idaho, we scoop up potatoes, and these are about the size of small potatoes. So I assume that's what Howard Hughes is going to do. That's just my take. And he said, well, so you're building equipment for what depth? And I said, well, wherever the nodules lie will be my depth. And I have heard that they lie 2 or 3 miles below the ocean surface, large fields. And he accepted that. We went through a number of other questions, and I might say leading questions.
How long were you with him?
All morning with my overheads. He wanted to go into calculations and visibility, the type of water I was going to be working in, like where are you going to be working? I said, wherever the nodules exist, and that's not up to me. That's up to the people at Summa Corporation. We got into some details about sea life, and I learned then and later that he was an expert on sea life. And he enjoyed talking about it, his collections of sea life and the aquaria that he'd been dealing with. He sponsored a lot of work in sea life. He was, I guess, impressed with Jacques Cousteau and people like that. He had an interesting group of friends, people he related to. So I heard a lot about his life growing up and all that. And as I recall, I heard nothing about Cambridge until later. He finally decided that he'd had enough and suggested maybe we have lunch. We went to the cafeteria, and then later, as Mr. Lindsay said, take him through our shops and show him how we build reconnaissance lenses, how we do things like Project Corona. He knows all about that. I did, parted ways. Next day, I heard briefly from Mr. Lindsay, thanks for the tour. Victor enjoyed the tour, the information and all that. Thank you very much. And that was it. Absolutely nothing after that. And so over the years, I go back to the first clue of the information you relate about the Cambridge Five and the clues that Victor left with me as part of the tour. I've tried to put that together, and the only thing I can come up with, his conclusion, is that this had to be set up as disinformation to ensure that whoever was contacting Victor in the future had the story that we wanted promulgated, and that is that we're working for Howard Hughes.
Yeah, from what I've read, he would have been the perfect conduit for that information into the Soviet Union intelligence services because, he kind of bridged that gap between the Western side and the Soviet side. And I'm sure there were people on the Soviet side who considered him to be a reliable and trusted source of information. So perfect conduit to help convince the Soviets that this indeed was a seafloor mining operation.
It was interesting. I also read the book Elusive Rothschild. I
Mhm.
highly recommend that to anybody that wants to understand the man.
Yeah,
And the one thing that came out of that was his angst over finding out that his dearest friend, Anthony Blunt, was part of the Cambridge Five. It bothered him quite a bit, but Blunt, he stayed with Blunt. In fact, Blunt rented for free an apartment in his building in London. And it occurred to me that either directly or through Blunt, information had to flow from his tour at ITAC to
yeah.
his so-called handler or whoever the conduit was to the Soviet Union.
Yes, I think it's very, I mean, I think he had lots of contacts with the Soviet Union. He's kind of in that gray area between the two. And I'm very convinced that they would have trusted what his judgment was on this. And so I think he was the perfect choice to try to get this information to be believed by the Soviet side.
That's very true. But it was an incredible surprise given the fact that we were sworn to secrecy forever and ever. Like there was no end to it, and suddenly I'm telling everything.
Well, it's clear they trusted you because you knew what was really going on, but they trusted you to talk to a guy who was going to talk to the Soviets. So that was quite a testimony to the way they trusted you.
So thank you, Mike. It's been quite a ride.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Joe. This has been fascinating and very exciting. I want to thank my wonderful guest today, Joe Houston. Joe, you certainly had a wonderful and incredibly productive career in service to our nation, and your contribution to Project Azorian was enormous. In addition to the crucially important data gathering by your underwater camera and lighting system during the Glomar 2 mission, I am convinced that your remarkable meeting with Lord Rothschild was key to selling the Howard Hughes seafloor mining cover story to the Soviets. So thanks again, Joe. It's been a privilege to get to know you and to interview you. And to my viewers, this is Mike Clancy. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video.
Thank you, Mike.